Yeah. So yesterday we couldn't finish the medieval part. We have some few slides remaining of yesterday, and we will resume the presentation from this one concerning Seus Scotus. Seus Scotus, as we have said yesterday, was the author who Lukasiewicz has attributed the Seus Scotus law. And in fact, Seus Scotus is an author, genius author, one of the best logicians of 14th century, and we don't know his name or her name, and this person has lost the chance of being in this between among the greatest logicians of all times. Both formula, these formulas are regimentation of these bold red lines. But when Seus Scotus starts to demonstrate the result in his commentary on prior anatomy, he deals with other inference, other form, more canonical form of text false, starting from Socrates exists and Socrates does not exist. The premise. Therefore, we have a conjunction here. Socrates does not exist. But therefore, also for the same rule, if we have a conjunction, we can have one of the conjuncts. Socrates exists in step 3. Therefore, Socrates exists or a man is a donkey by disjunctive syllogism. But Socrates does not exist from 2 to second step. Therefore, a man is a donkey. That is the textual steps by Seus Scotus. And formalizing this deduction, we have the following deduction, which is very similar, for example, to the Lewis proofs in 20s and 30s. We have here an additional evidence that if we are looking for to create a system that could be very consistent, we had a problem with disjunctive syllogism. And this deduction is very sound, very elegant, and it is from between 1340, 1315, 1350. We don't know exactly the times, but in the history of logic, we have a lot of the prejudice about the contributions of other periods of the history. The Morgan laws, for example, are very well known by the medievals. It's not the Morgan law. It is called the Morgan laws because we are accustomed to do so. But historically, effectively, we have evidence that they know medievals have a very complete account of logical consequence with propositional logic, fragments of first order logic by the way of syllogism, categorical syllogism, and several theories, different expositions of modal logic, and not only just electric modal logic, but especially non-electric modal logic they have. As it may be seen at this point in the development of medieval logic, the X-Fausto has been completely integrated into the well-developed theory of consequentiae as we find it in Pseudoscorus. The elegance of his treatment attests the very mature development of logical classical paradigm, in this case in detriment of other perspectives such as those of relevance and consistency. To the extent that the logical classical citizenship may be considered to the rule, there is a logical classical solution to the conflict. On the other hand, in rejecting the X-Fausto and the logical classical solution to the phenomenon of contradiction, various authors have delineated an alternative approach which encompasses elements pertinent to the paradigm now known as paraconsistent. Especially in the new edition of the book for in English, we have included other authors. Buridan is one of them, Nicolas d'Autrecourt, Thomas Aquinas, some of these authors are entirely inserted in a classical context of logical theory. Pope of Venice and Domingo de Soto and Pedro da Fonseca. And here we can see Iberic authors, because the Middle Ages officially ends in the 15th century, but there is no sharp cut into history. So the Iberic authors, especially some religious authors such as Jesuits, Dominicians, and other scholars, have cultivated for medieval paradigm in logic until the beginning of the 17th century. In the recent historiography of paraconsistent logic has been challenged to deal with the problematic eponymous attribution, which associates the X-Fausto with certain scholars without sufficient basis. And we believe that it may be affirmed with a certain sureness that the X-Fausto cannot be attributed to Aristotle. According to John of Salisbury, William of Soissons learned about the X-Fausto from Adam of Bauchamp. The merit of the Parvic-Montaigne school essentially consists in disseminating and propagating the legitimacy of the X-Fausto. And just to be a bit transparent here with you, 2007, I think, Graham Christie has a work in which he proposes to call X-Fausto William's law. And we disagree with this reading because lack of historical evidence. Okay? It seems that it's not until the early 12th century, with the logical doctrine of Adam of Bauchamp, that we find anyone explicitly endorsing the X-Fausto, the principle that says that anything follows from what is impossible. Attributions to the rule of X-Fausto to William Soissons, John dos Scotus, to Pseudoscorus himself, or to John of Cornwall, a Philotheus Boehner hypothesis, derived from the suggestion made by Lukashevich in his celebrated work on Aristotle's syllogism, are also imprecise. At the present stage of research and sources, it seems temerarious to associate the ex falso to any eponymous attribution. Eponymous attribution is when we link a scientific fact, a scientific law, a theoretical fact to the name of a person, such as Newton's laws, Pythagoras' theorem, and so on. We believe that it may be affirmed with certain sureness that also Abelard knew of the ex falso. If for eponymous attribution it's sufficient for an author to know of the principle that carries that author's name, it would be more than just to attribute the ex falso to Abelard. However, if it's necessary as well for an author to approve what he or she knows, then only the negation of the ex falso could be correctly attributed to ex falso, to Abelard. We believe that may be affirmed also with certain sureness that Adam of Bauschel is the earliest non-explicit proponent of the ex falso. On a purely chronological basis, the role should be attributed to him, the master, not to the student, because William Sosson learned from the principle in Adam of Bauschel schools. As whatever attribution in this case seems to be in some way unsatisfactory, we argue that the ex falso not be referred to by any eponymous nomenclature. This will avoid future reviews of literature such as the present one. And in history of logic, we have a lot of misunderstandings about who are the persons who have made the contributions, especially by the lack of history, because logic is a field that maybe by Kant's influence we have lack of history. But historical studies concerning logic are growing a lot recently. But Kant is in the preface of the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, he said that in a free way of speaking, he says that logic has no history, and this conclusion have made its impact. The denial of the ex falso, the rule ex falso non sequitur condelibit, may be appropriately called Abelard's law, in tribute to the analysis and the conclusions of the great medieval logician, one of the first to openly reject and explicitly argue against the acceptance of the ex falso. That is, I think, our major conclusion about all this polemic at the moment, and to find to close the medieval exposition in the discourse. In the medieval authors studied, we have a strong theoretical tension with regard to the phenomena of consistency and inconsistency in rational contexts, especially philosophical or theological contexts. However, as we have seen, even several thinkers favorable to the ex falso, even Pseudo-Scotus himself, consider and justify the possibility of the restricted non-validity of ex falso by means of conceptual and argumentative nuances. What we can say is that in these authors, for example, Pseudo-Scotus, the things are not black or white. They have nuances. For example, Pseudo-Scotus, very wise logician, he has kept the point concerning Aristotelian syllogisms from opposite premises. Pseudo-Scotus had had full awareness that reductio ad absurdum does not apply to that cases. So it's not so hard. These authors were much more embracing when they are thinking about logical theory than us. Thus, we have another theoretical context, theoretical situation in the age of the logical systems. Such tension materialized in the acceptance of the rejection of the logical rule, now ever since that era as the ex-falso sector quadrilibet. The logical classical solution to the problem was to grant logical theoretical citizenship to the rule, in contrast, by rejecting the ex-falso and the logical classical solution to the phenomenon of contradiction. Several authors had outlined an alternative approach that contains elements belonging to the paradigm that is now known as preconsistent. Despite the weakening of the interest in formal logic in modern period, many of the above elements persist in the methodological epistemological debate so dear to the modernity. Modern authors have been more easily led to accept as decisive the methodological criteria of a logical classical nature, according to which any inconsistencies or contradictions inevitably led the rational theories in which they occur to falsehood, triviality. They know about the fact. This predominance of the logical classical approach in the modern period was framed in this context, and the situation was only definitively reconsidered with the advent of contemporary consistency. So we have reached the end of the medieval time session. Yeah, of course.
Okay, we are proposing that the new law, ex falso non sequitur quadrilibet, be called Abelard's law. At the beginning, we conjectured to suggest Heloise's law, celebrating the great logician and his love. But then we decided to propose Abelard's law. Recall the discussion during the Middle Ages was very important, it was relevant. And several authors didn't accept in general the law that would be called ex falso sequitur quadrilibet. And I would like to observe again, João Marcos, I think that yesterday, you observed the difference that you have discussed between ex contradictione and ex falso. During the first class, Evandro talked about this. He mentioned, we have published a paper about Guerlain of Besançon, and in the paper about Miracle Quesada, celebrating Miracle Quesada, we explained the appearance of the terms. And during the Middle Ages, ex impossibile was much more used, ex falso, but by John of Salisbury for the first time, idem esse ex contradictione, and we have shown that the first one to use ex contradictio seems to have been Mortensen in his book. Andrés Bobenhit in his thesis, ex contradictione sequitur quadrilibet. And we said that there are, in spite of the nuances of the use of the term, we agree with you. Nowadays, we may have a difference between ex falso and ex contradictione, but we claimed that we use in the classes and in our work, in general, ex falso sequitur quod libet as a more general name incorporating all the others. But we may have difference. There are different nuances. The ex contradictione is a particular case of the ex falsus, would be a particular case of the ex falso. But this discussion is very interesting, especially during the Middle Ages. He mentioned that some authors try to call the law of John of Cornwall, but because there are authors who consider that Pseudo-Scotus would be John of Cornwall. But we have also looked at the papers, and we are not convinced. They are not contemporary, the style is not the same, and so the authors that we are calling Pseudo-Scotus, in fact, we don't know who was him. Okay. But we know the period where he lived. He was contemporary of John of Burton. This is very beautiful for us, for our consistency. Don't you think? All this research.
Thank you, Professor. So we start to.
So can I ask a question about the medieval before? Oh, thank you. So my question, I have a question about the relationship between notion of consistency and the notion of modality. Because like throughout the lecture, many thinkers talk a lot about the modal notion, right? Like a necessity. Abelard talks about the Yeah. So then I even got an impression that for medieval thinkers, ex falso, meaning that from contradiction you can get anything, and another principle, ex impossibility.
Yeah.
From impossibility you can get anything. These two looks like interchangeably. It's the same for medieval thinkers. Could you tell me a bit more about how they think of this?
Yeah, this is the medieval authors. For example, the next author I will quote here, Pedro da Fonseca, Portuguese Jesuit from the 16th century. But this is found in medieval sources. They not always, because there are a lot of nuance between authors. They don't have a standard to call the laws. They describe the laws. They are doing logic in a meta language. It's very characteristic of medieval authors that they are not. They don't have a formal, separated level of language. They do everything in natural language, Latin in this case, and they describe what they are considering correct or incorrect, in some cases discussing the results. In fact, we find in several authors the statements ex impossibili sequitur codalibiti, or other, that there is some variations in the statement. And in the examples, they are examples that are impossible, saying that the impossible is false. So they link the two notions, but we know that are different things.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. I don't know.
Thank you very much.
Maybe relating the falsity of the contradiction with the impossibility. That is, I think.
Yeah.
And Petrus Hispanus, for instance, he uses ex impossibility.
Yeah. But ex impossibility is far it's far enough. The most used form, especially in the later scholastics after 20th century.
Yeah, you said that Aristotle is not committed to the ex falso, and I don't want to challenge the reading, which I thought was super interesting, of the passages of the prior analytics you proposed. I want to grant that, but like the corpus of Aristotle's work is huge, and the interpreters have been trying to deal with the inconsistencies of these corpuses forever. And even within the same work, like the metaphysics, it's a struggle for interpreters to figure out whether book one is actually consistent with the things that are said in other books, right? So my question is, when it comes, I'm not certain if it, I think it's book 4 of the metaphysics, when he's talking about this also known fiction, and then he describes his opponent. And he says, like, he seems to be suggesting, at least according to the standard reading, that the one who accepts a contradiction is no better than a vegetable. So it's someone who falls short of logos. So my question is, do you think that even in this passage, which I think is from book 4 of the Metaphysics, even in that book, Aristotle is not committed to the ex falso, or only in the prior analytics, those passages that you mentioned?
This question, okay, thank you. We must remember that Christopher Martin, in a recent paper, has explained a point very sensitive. Ancient authors generally, they don't quote, they don't state what they consider wrong. They don't state what they consider that is not valid. And that would be the reason why we don't find ex falso between Stoics, in Aristotle, and any other in many others commentators of late antiquity. So I understand. I think that Bukigama of Metaphysica has is an impressive apology of non-contradiction, of course. But this interpretation, this book with some chapters in metaphysics, have made impressive effect on all of us. If you primarily think that looks at logic as a metaphysical constraints, you cannot accept other interpretations than the classical in Aristotle, because the own fact that the Bukigama is prevail on the other minor or scripts, or just is a bit isolated, such as the chapters that I have presented. I don't know. I don't know, but I believe that Aristotle. We don't have, at the moment. We don't have how to know if Aristotle really knew about this source, because that passages are a matter of interpretation, and there Aristotle are establishing some limitations about what we can deduce from false premises. He recognizes that we can deduce something, but not, and he discusses the meaning, logical and aleatic meaning of what we can deduce, but as if he is worried about the proliferation of some views. It's a mark of some of the main Aristotelian tests. He is debating with other persons that he doesn't explicitly say to us what he is contraposing. I don't know if I could answer your question.
It's okay. It's okay. It's just I just wonder whether the claim that he's not committed to ex-fossil needs to be qualified. Like say like that passage, he was not committed.
Okay.
When it comes to other moments in the words, maybe he is, and he just doesn't. It just doesn't have like a consistent view. I tend to think that this. I would be inclined to defend this kind of reading.
Yeah. Yes. I have some. I'm sympathetic to a way of reading some texts that are a bit today are not so up to date in the view of some interpreters. For example, Bohensky has an answer, a genetic answer to this problem. For example, Metaphysics book Gamma was written when Aristotle was younger, and he was debating with the sophists, and he had the necessity to put things sharply and clearly against sophistry. But, in fact, when he builds his deductive theory, he needed more of a so strong position against contradiction, because he has a strong deductive system that is syllogistic, and it allows him to defend himself from sophistry and sophists without have to make so strong commitments on non-contradiction. But again, that is interpretation. But the letter of the texts are very strong in metaphysics. It is because we never know it and I. We never claim that Aristotle is a guy that is a dialectist, because it is an absurd. Because at most Aristotle could see, could get that in some contexts, under certain conditions, we have a phenomenon. In Bukigama, for example, he recognized clearly the phenomena of trivialization without using the name. Because he says, if you agree with Heraclitus, that says that A and not A is the case, we will prove everything. So they are worried about the fact that the presence of contradiction has a very inconvenient situation derived, that is the falsification of all entire knowledge, scientific knowledge project that he is building there. But we can, but I agree with you. I think maybe we have weak a bit our statement, because in fact it is what we also think about.
So you argued, very convincingly, that a number of medieval authors intended to reject this fossil agreement. But you also showed us, well, remove the but, and you also showed us Pseudo-Scotus arguing that if you endorse disjunction, introduction, and elimination, then you end up having sparsely coded anyway. And my question is, are the authors, the medieval authors that intended to reject the sparso, aware of this? And did they also reject disjunction, introduction, and elimination? Because otherwise it would seem that maybe they intended to reject it, but they didn't have the sophistication and technical means to.
Yeah, Pseudo Scotus is a very good illustration, a very good example of a higher level of logical technique in Middle Ages. Higher level. For example, Peter Abelard was very creative, prestigious logicians, has influenced later theories after him, but the style of his position is very different. In Abelard, for example, we have some different theories, logical theories, for example, topical theory, syllogistic, Stoic, propositional logic from Stoics, but they don't know or they don't mention that it's Stoic, but we can see that it is Stoic because it's very, very known by us and by Stoics, Maud Stalling, syllogism, disjunctive syllogism, double negation, they contraposition. Abelard uses all this stuff to discuss, but when we may say the clarity of the presentation is improving with the time because the evolution of medieval language and logic. I don't know if I
Yes,
answer you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Just interested in some notational problem between the X parcel and X contribution. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I had some private discussion with some philosopher, Professor Jeffrey Huffman at Minnesota University, and he preferred to use X contradiction rather than X parcel because X parcel seems to say that falsity imply anything, but X contradiction imply anything. So, especially some different contexts, like even in paraconsistent logic, contradiction is not false. Sometimes it has a both values. So, I'm just interested in what is the better notation for our discussions about X parcel or X contradiction.
Okay, thank you. Very, very nice comment. Even in Greek logic, ancient logic, and medieval times, we don't have a logical. We have at most use of variables. Aristotle uses variables. Stoics uses variables. But in the later antiquity, they stopped using variables. They started to describe. For example, some logical laws by medievals are announced as the negation of two conjunctive propositions are the same as the disjunction of the negated propositions. That's the way that the Mormon law appears. And the others, they always working giving interpreted examples, not formal examples. Socrates is one of the most common character in the medieval textbooks. Socrates is a stone, and so on. And at most they have a kind of, so we have two kinds of notation. Rhetorical notation, rhetorical because they explain what is happening inside the law, the logical result, or at most a syncopated form describe that is a mixture between words and sometimes variables, or sometimes abbreviation of something. Formal notation, this is the case, especially for mathematics also. In Middle Ages, mathematics has a poor notation. Our notation is very new, very recent in history, 250 years at most. We can see, for example, in 20th century, of course, but in 19th century, how great progress could be done in mathematics to denoting, to spelling out the mathematical notions into symbols. This is a very slow process along the centuries. Thank you. Thank you. Let's start the modern first. So, in the context of modern era, in fact, philosophically complex and formally poor. As we have shown, medieval logic was constituted on the basis of distinct logical traditions, joining elements of the peripatetic, megaric, historic, and grammatical traditions. The sparse logical formal elements cultivated in 16th and 17th Europe reflect and distinct medieval logical traditions. Modern scholars are famous for their contributions to philosophy, though exiguous with regard to the application of logic to epistemology and methodology, incorporate very little formal logic in their theoretical elaborations. We will start with Nicholas of Cusa, that is an author between two words. He is the last of medieval and the first of moderns. Cusanus was an enemy of the principle of non-contradiction, and he is, maybe he's still alive, we are talking about him. Cusanus is an intellectual of great horizons. At the gates of modernity, he is the first to face opposites as a promising approach. One of the most doctrines by Cusanus, most celebrated doctrines, is coincidentia oppositorum, coincidence of the opposites. We will deal with especially three works by Cusanus, and the doctrine of the learned, the ignorance, the doctrine ignorantia, on the vision of God, the visione Dei, and the burial. These works were produced, finished, concluded in these years. Not so far after his death, because he has died in 64. And I will select 3 or 4 quotations to illustrate, because all this stuff has a lot of difficulties that we have to face to make affirmations, make claims about. Here we have a quotation from the Doctrine Ignorantia, of the learned ignorance, and it's the first work that make Nicholas of Cusa famous, this work. However, the absolutely maximum transcendence all our understanding, for our intellect cannot by means of reasoning combine contradictories in their beginning, since we proceed by means of what nature makes evident to us. Our reason falls far short of the infinite power and is unable to connect contradictories which are infinitely distant. But in the career of Nicholas of Cusa, he also improves the description of the coincidence of opposites. This excerpt is taken from the Visione Dei, and we have one of the most beautiful metaphors of Cusanus concerning the coincidence of the opposites, and that is the wall of paradise. God is inside the paradise. Paradise has walls. The walls of paradise are the coincidence of the opposites. We just can come in the paradise passing through the coincidence of opposites. And I have found the abode wherein you dwell, unveiled, an abode surrounded by the coincidence of opposites, of contradictories. And this coincidence is the wall of paradise, wherein you dwell. Therefore, on the other side of the coincidence of contradictories, you can be seen, but not all on this side. So, without admitting coincidence of opposites, we cannot see God. It's a very important fact about Nicholas of Cusa. He was a priest, he was a cardinal from Catholic Church, and he is one of the most important mysticals of the Catholic tradition. At the side of Teresa of Avila, Francis of Assisi, and the other great personalities of Catholic Christianity. So in the Berillo, that is one of the later works, he reaches the best description of what would be the coincidence of opposites. Berillo, the burial is a jewel, a lens, a transparent lens that will put Cusa's time. We already have clashes, so he uses the metaphor of the lens of a lens to see that the coincidence of the opposites is a lens, and the lens allows us to see. Without the lens, we can't see. The quotation is that if an intellectual burial that had both a maximum and a minimum form were fitted into our intellectual eyes, then through the intermediateness of this burial, the indivisible beginning of all things would be attained. Now, just how this attained would become about, I propose to explain as clear as I can with the help of certain premises that are useful to this end. So this is I think we have a second quotation of the burial, and the burial would be a paraconsistent device, maybe because especially Cusanus is a Neoplatonic author also. He has other very different starting point from the other medieval authors, and the resuming of the discovery of Plato's works happens in Renaissance, and Cusa is in the very beginning of the Renaissance, and he absorbs a lot Neoplatonic influences that will struggle with Aristotelian purity, that marked and represented in a way very exaggerated in the, especially in the later scholasticism at the final of the European Middle Ages. Nicholas of Cusa was an adversary of the principle of non-contradiction. He says, all of the foregoing writers, along with all the others I have seen, have lacked the burial. They couldn't see through the opposites. Now, it is important to be able to attach oneself firmly to the doctrine of the conjunction of the opposites. Although we know that we ought to do such, nevertheless, when we revert to the reason's inferences, we often slip and endeavor to furnish rational support for the most certain side, which is beyond all rational support. And one what I will say is a project of research, because Nicholas of Cusa uses a lot of oxymorous constructions, natural language constructions that are opposing, for example, awake and awakely sleeping. His language in all his writings are plenty of oxymorons. And it was the manner that he expressed this intellectual perception, that we need rationality to grasp the opposites. But what we see is beyond all rationality. So he is a very dialectical author, in fact. So Nicholas of Cusa is an author that will have a very important role in history, and we are not stating that he is an anticipation of, because statements of Nicholas of Cusa are very, they have a very special context. Neoplatonism, Christianism, Christian Pythagoreanism, he has a lot of presuppositions, and his theories have all meaning there. So we have to take a lot of care to make some statements about. Domingos de Soto is one of those Iberic authors. He is Spanish, and his exposition of theological theory is accurate and proficient, with the precision equal to that of the great medieval synthesis. The doctrine of consequentia pervades and structures Soto's exposition of logical theory. We have this portrait, a bit dark, but it's from him, Fray Domingo Soto, but could be a bit more color. In its Sumulae, Soto states the talk about the text also the following way. From the impossible follows anything. Indication to be established to each of those, each applies. So, for the Soto, we are in 1540 is the year, the first edition. Exalted does not apply widespreadly. No, ex impossibly has a scope of application. That is, the good consequences is sustained. Then, then being impossible, and the consequent being impossible, contingent and necessary. And in his Sumulae, we found a strong criticism about exhaust. Because the idea that we have seen in Middle Ages, even between Stoics, that the relevance, what we are calling relevance between the consequent and the antecedent, and that idea never disappears. And there are ups and downs in the history of logic, ups and downs. And at the final of the scholastic logic, we have a revival of the idea that the consequent must be contained in some way in the antecedent. So that is the criticism of Soto here in 16th century. He is resuming the position sustained by some medieval authors against exhaust. All moderns here are not the moderns, Descartes, Bacon, Locke, no. Moderns are Logica Modernorum. He is referring to the authors from 13th, 14th century, Bouquedin, for example. All moderns admit that this consequence is good, exhaust, that ex impossible. Hence, they conclude that every consequence good antecedent is impossible is good, so that anything follows from the impossible. Not only in the sense we admit above, but absolutely. Absolutely. Indeed, I think nothing intelligible follows from it, or from cause to effect, or from general to a species, or something similar. However, they say this, that the good consequence is twofold, one by intrinsic modes and the other by extrinsic mode. Occam has used a lot this distinction. Nonetheless, without doubt, this distinction is pure invention, since it is not sustained by any authority or reason. Authority here is not is an authoritas, a statement of an important author. It's not an authority in, for example, in civil sense or religious sense, church authority is not in this sense. So therefore, the necessary does not follow from anything, nor does anything follows from the impossible. So the position of Soto was very surprising for us, just in Renaissance, just in 16th century. Other person who have very successful producing textbooks was Pedro da Fonseca. Peter of Fonseca. Both they are modern. We don't translate the names anymore. Pedro da Fonseca was a Portuguese Jesuit who was a professor at the College of Arts of the University of Coimbra from 55 to 61 in 16th century. He completed the first edition of his Institutionum Dialecticarum Libri Octo in 64. Translating the title of the book, Institutionum, one of the translation is classes of dialectic. They pay attention, dialectic, the name returns. Because the Renaissance, early modern authors try to resume the way logic was studied in classical times by Cicero, by Epictetus, by Roman Stoicists, for example, of Roman Imperial age. Pedro da Fonseca logical exposition was very successful, earning him the title of the Portuguese Aristotle. This is a statue of him in Proença a Nova, the city where he was born. The didactic clarity of Pedro da Fonseca, Institutionum Dialecticarum, is of high level, and his exposition of logical theory is erudite. While Pedro da Fonseca, another Iberic author very important in that century, has also written a very famous introduction to logic, Introductio in Dialectica Aristotelis, have had 18 editions. Fonseca's book has got 55 editions. And these books, these Iberic books were used all around Europe, Germany, all European universities. In spite of the divisions between Protestants and Catholics, they use these textbooks books because it is accuracy and very good qualities for teaching. Here we have a quotation in which Soto is much more against, clearly contrary to the impossibility. Soto considered that the rules is not reasonable. Fonseca not so much. He agrees with the rule, but you see, he uses the solution of John Buridan, and in the examples we see that from an impossible everything follows. Since there is some coherency between what is deduced from what follows the deduction. Good and vicious consequences are usually distinguished mainly by two indications. First, if it follows from the truth of the antecedent, giving at least as a hypothesis that the consequence is true, the consequence is good and active. If not, it is vicious and inactive. For the same reason, we affirm that these are apt. Socrates is the stone, therefore Socrates is senseless. If Socrates were a bird, he could undoubtedly fly. Because although neither of the two antecedents is true, nevertheless, from the supposed and the known truth of both, it follows that the consequences are true. So, very, very intriguing passage that it uses the same Buridan's strategy, showing us that they couldn't be full-fledged formalists. They have to take into account the meaning of the terms, and his logic was produced to be used in disputational contests, social contests of linguistic contests at the end. From most angles, the doctrines developed by Pedro da Fonseca are of logical classical character. However, his reserve with regard to the indiscriminate validity of the ex falso and his appeal to the modalization of this notion allow us to consider that a certain degree of logical relevance between antecedent and consequent is found in his work. So, Leibniz, we started the moderns as we are more familiarized. In his philosophical project, Leibniz sought to conciliate opposing points of view, what could suggests that his philosophy could be interpreted in a broad sense as having a pre-consistent underlying logic. There are numerous examples of his attempts to conciliate opposing views in his works, as seen in the final sessions of the discourses on metaphysics.
Something before continuing. We decided to introduce Fonseca, De Soto in our book. They are very important. But we observed that in the Anglo-Saxon literature, even in the historians of logic, they are not very well mentioned. Almost nothing about them, and they were very important. And this is in accord with Professor Salamer's observations during his courses. Only the Anglo-Saxon authors are well mentioned and claimed.
Thank you, Ita. In fact, and we can surely say that in early modernity, Descartes studied with a Mexican textbook of logic by Alonso de Veracruz. So we ignore that the teaching of logic in 15, second half, 16th and 17th century, before real logic, depends a lot of a huge literature on logic, metaphysics that was cultivated in Iberic countries and their colonies. Unfortunately, not in Brazil, because Portuguese take so hard with us, and you don't have schools for much time. And when we started to get here Jesuit schools and universities, they were expelled out of the country in the 18th century. But between nuestros hermanos, colonized by Spanish, they have schools at this very since the beginning. And they have very good authors who have a very good production on logic, original ideas, and they could, for example, serve La Flèche, a Jesuit college where Descartes has taken his first studies and advanced studies also. So there is a lot of geopolitical choices also in history and in the way we tell the history. And there are other absences that we couldn't feel right now, but we expect that the future generations of historians could have be available to know that a lot of other people could have made wonderful things in all fields of knowledge, and that they could include, and we could have in future a more complete, but a more just balanced portrait of the historical past. Marcelo Dascal, a Brazilian scholar that worked a lot on Leibniz, argues that Leibniz's principle of sufficient reason requires a soft notion of reason, and his interpretation sheds new light on the nature of Leibniz's rationalism. Although we consider this hermeneutical proposal very interesting and promising, we will focus on the decisive textual evidence in some Leibniz important logical works in which a pronounced logical classical paradigm is clearly maintained. The principle of identity plays an important role in Leibniz's system. identity and idempotence are the basis of his conception of truth. Not rarely, he employs the principle of non-contradiction in association with the principle of identity for the demonstration of the primary truths, exactly as he proceeds in Principia Logico Metaphysica of 1689. A is A and cannot be not A. And you can check that version of the principle of non-contradiction. It's a Leibnizian version, and this version is found in Kant, in Wolff, and in a lot of other German authors before Leibniz. Leibniz has produced a great influence on the posterior discussion. For Leibniz, the principle of non-contradiction is not merely a mere logical principle that is theoretically isolated from other parts of his philosophy. It is, in fact, one of the cornerstones of this system. According to Lenzen, given that the impossible is inconsistent and false, the trivialization there implied is inevitable, what affiliates Leibniz's theoretical approach to the logical classical paradigm. Leibniz was the herald of logic and rationality, and declared the enemy of contradiction. Although he had worked to bring together opposing philosophical points of view and to solve practical and theoretical conflicts, the principle of identity, the exclude the middle, and the principle of non-contradiction were constant presence in his intellectual journey. Leibniz also talks about a Bladeur Hatio, soft reason. So, in some contexts, Leibniz argues that we could adapt our rationality approach in order to better discuss, better understand, better reply to a problem. But in general, the situation of Leibniz in the history of prior consistency until now, and we don't have, we have a lot of important works of Leibniz available, but his work remains waiting for publication. Wolff is a Leibnizian follower, and at the beginning of 18th century, the principle of non-contradiction played a key role in the rationalist system of Christian Wolff. Being, claims Wolff, follows from non-contradiction, given that a thing cannot simultaneously be and not to be. Wolff is very important because he is the link between Leibniz and Kant. Kant will struggle with the rationalism of Wolff. And we have in our textbooks of logic that the principle of identity, non-contradiction, exclude the middle are the most principles of reason, maybe because Leibniz and Wolff. Because in Middle Ages, for example, these principles don't have this place so detached, comparing with other principles at that time. Wolff aligns himself. Oh, a point here. Being follows from non-contradiction. For the rationalists, being is non-contradictory. And remember you, an important mathematician of the 20th century, the roots of Hilbert's position that everything that could be, we can deal with everything since it be consistently thought, conceived, explained. Wolff aligns himself with the Leibnizian premises according to which rational knowledge, logical rational consistency is enough for existence. In his Philosophica Prima Sive Ontologia, Wolff claims that what is possible is that what does not induce or imply any contradiction. This idea is very important to the German rationalism and our continental philosophy, as we also says in the tradition of the history of philosophy. And so for us also, because for some people, and we ourselves sometimes, we tend to think logic as an ontology. And when we do so, we tend to be classical. Because our basis, ontological categories are also classical. So, Hume is in your book because in his An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, in the chapter 8, he presents a very well done reductio ad absurdum. So we include him in this account of the ex-spouse and consistency and all the stuff we are dealing, because his use of classical strategy. Because he is one of the authors who explicitly uses an reductio ad absurdum strategy. Kant and non-contradiction. Non-contradiction is very important to Kant. Theoretical consistency is quite evident in Kant's transcendental doctrine. Kant claims that conformity to the principle of non-contradiction is, at most, a necessary condition for truth and knowledge. And the notion of consistency is central to his transcendental scheme that illustrates Kant's option for a classical, logical, theoretical approach, the principal and most important one in his theoretical setting. The principle of non-contradiction plays a fundamental role in the transcendental analytics, and Kant recognizes the dignity of the supreme principle of all a priori analytic judgments. Contradiction for Kant is one of the main sources of error. As such, the principle contributes to the recognition of truth to the extent that knowledge must be consistent above all, and its theoretical relevance derives from this fact. Although Kant does not explicitly admit the ex falso, it is presupposed in view of the destructive epistemic potential of contradictions. If some indication of non-classical logical theoretical approach appears in the principle of pure reason, Kant appears to be placed it not in the path of consistency, but of intuitionism. But he required that transcendental demonstration must be not apagogic, but ostensive. So we reach Hegel. Hegel is a very important author for history of philosophy and several other fields of knowledge, but he is especially important to the history of consistency, because Hegel, as a very celebrated author, his work is very important, but he is sympathetic to the contradiction because the way he formulates his dialectics. In the case of the Hegel, we add the S at the final because we are talking about substantive. Dialectics in Hegel's and Marx's sense has a kind of personality. We don't must confuse dialectics with dialectic, that is the dialectic of Plato, of Aristotle, and one of the names of logic has used it as effort along the history of the logic. And it's remarkable, George Hegel's position and contribution to rehabilitating the role of contradiction. And in knowledge, he opened the philosophical trails so that other theoreticians could seriously consider the role of contradiction in broad rational contexts. For Hegel, logic constitutes, presents, and describes rationality, rational totality. Truth can only happen with the full establishment of the principle of contradiction. It's not of non-contradictions. It is the reason in our book we systematically use principle of non-contradiction in a normative sense, referring what the PMC usually means for scholars, because for Hegel, principle of non-contradiction is false. The truth follows from the principle of contradiction, which in turn can only become effective with the refutation, strictly speaking, of the principle of non-contradiction. This kind of apology of the contradictory status is explicit and is new in the scenario in the history of modern philosophy. Hegel defended the idea that contradiction is the role of truth. The rule of truth, a thesis sustained by him during his entire philosophical career. For Hegel, the rational is not possible without the contradictory. The Hegelian posture encouraged the theorists to explore the trails of paraconsistency, and he is considered by the forerunners of paraconsistent logic and ally of great importance. For example, here we have two quotations, one of Vassiliev, a Russian physician and philosopher, and he demonstrates the idea that yes, we can talk about it because Hegel opened the path to be explored. We can take it seriously. Vassiliev says, but if the proposition and the inference remain, and the law of contradiction here in Vassiliev is non-contradiction. It's non-contradiction because that is the name that principle of non-contradiction had until the 30s in 20th century. Just with the advent of non-classical logics that we start to be more incisive in standarding the use of the term. Again, if proposition and the inference remained and the law of contradiction lost its power, would we refuse to call such thinking logical? Imagine the world of realizing the contradiction, where the cognizing subjects would formulate contradictions in the form of propositions, where contradictions would be inferred. Would not this cognition be logical? Wasn't Hegel's thinking, his great dialectics of the contradictions, logical? So we can demonstrate the straight influence of the reception of Hegel's ideas by the forerunners and the founders of paraconsistency in our time. At the beginning of the 20th century, particular importance must be attributed to the rebirth of the study of logic, metaphysics, and ontology, the foundations of mathematics and science, especially in Central Europe. And we are talking about Poland. Start to talk about Poland. Because there we will, since the 19th century in Central Europe, the European borders have changed a lot because of the wars, because of the conflicts. But we live today is Ukraine, but in the beginning of the century, 20th century was Poland, and in that part of Europe, where today we have part of Poland, part of Ukraine, part of Germany, we have a lot of effervescence, and that effervescence does not is just by Hegel's influence, but other currents of thought. For example, Alexius Meinong, he will exert an enormous influence on Lukashevich, Edmund Husserl, the founder of the modern Vassiliev also. And in this context, we will reach, the time is over, we will reach, with goals tomorrow, reach an environment of the great philosophical creativity associated with genius authors, and the two 1910. 1910. This is the year. It's a very important year for consistency, because in this year, as Jan Łukasiewicz publishes his famous monography that finally has been translated into English in 2021, and in this very year, 1910, we have the publication of Vassiliev starts publishing a paper by year, 1910, 11, 12, 13, 14. One of these 2 years, he has 2 works. And this, we can consider, I think in the future we will see it with much more clarity, that this year is very decisive for the future of non-classical logics, because these works have started a discussion that Lukashevich himself will contribute to non-classical logics, creating trivial logic and generalizing it before. And the 20s, after the 20s, we will have, at the end of the decade, intuitionism, and I admire that 1910 is a very meaningful year for the history of non-classical logic in special. Thank you very much.